I left my land untouched for a year, only to return and find an entire row of luxury mansions towering over it. Built without my permission, funded by lies, and protected by the most corrupt HOA in the county. They thought I'd never come back. They never expected I still owned everything beneath them. The road leading back to my hometown felt both familiar and foreign, like a half-forgotten memory trying to find its way back into focus. A full year had passed since I last drove through those quiet stretches of open farmland, the same route I had taken countless times before life forced me away. I had promised myself that my absence would be temporary, that I would return soon, reclaim the life I had paused, and pick up where I left off. But a year has a way of changing more than just circumstances. It changes landscapes, expectations, and the silent assumptions people make when they think no one is watching. My land had always been a refuge to me. Acres of untouched soil, an unfinished cabin tucked into the trees, and plans sketched out for a home that would eventually stand proudly at the center. It was the kind of place that felt secluded enough to breathe, yet close enough to town to feel connected. I had bought it piece by piece, working extra hours, cutting back on everything, sacrificing comfort for the dream of ownership. It wasn't just land, it was stability. It was the future. When I left, I boarded up the cabin, locked the gate, and notified the county that I'd be away but reachable. I kept paying property taxes on time. I maintained every document, every receipt, every boundary map. My land was not abandoned. It was simply waiting for me. But the moment I turned down the final mile-long stretch toward my property, the world I expected wasn't there. Instead of open fields, I saw rows of towering structures. Shiny, polished, modern homes stacked side by side like they were competing for attention. Massive driveways, stone veneers, immaculate lawns, imported palm trees, and brand new streetlights lined a road that didn't exist 12 months ago. Mansions, real, expansive mansions, stood on ground that unmistakably belonged to me. At first, my mind refused to process it. I slowed to a crawl, thinking perhaps I had taken the wrong road. But the landmarks, the ridge to the east, the bend in the tree line, the old fencing were unmistakable. This was my land. This was my property. And someone had built an entire luxury subdivision on top of it. The HOA signs were the next punch in the gut. Bold metal placards stood at the entrances, their polished surfaces reflecting sunlight like trophies. The letters were unmistakable. The community name was new, but the HOA logo wasn't. I had seen it before, years ago, on the opposite side of the neighborhood, a place that had always been careful not to overstep its boundaries. Yet here they were, not just overstepping, but swallowing my entire property whole. I parked just at the edge of the pavement because pavement itself was a violation. My land had never been paved. Seeing black asphalt cut across the soil I once walked barefoot on felt like trespassing in reverse, as if they had invaded my past, my plans, and my patience. And the most surreal part was the activity. Movers carrying furniture into houses sitting on my acreage. Contractors adjusting sprinklers and planting flowers. Residents walking dogs, strolling with coffee cups, pushing strollers. It was a fully functioning community built entirely on land that did not legally belong to them. The scope was staggering. The HOA hadn't just nibbled at my boundary line. They had devoured the entire thing. They must have assumed, based on my silence, my absence, and maybe rumors, that I had disappeared for good. That the empty cabin meant the land had been abandoned. That no one would care. But I cared. And I was back. As I walked deeper into the development, I felt a strange mix of disbelief and cold clarity. The mansions were not cheap. They were multi-million-dollar homes, crafted with expensive materials, likely sold to families with the promise of exclusivity and prestige. And every one of those families was unknowingly living on stolen soil. What baffled me most was the sheer confidence the HOA must have had to pull this off. They had drawn maps, laid foundations, poured concrete, sold properties, collected fees, and built an entire facade of legitimacy. They had erected structures on land they neither owned nor rented nor held any rights to. They had built an empire on an assumption that the real owner would never return. I made my way toward the area where my cabin once stood. Instead, I found a new building, the HOA's Community Operations Center. The irony was cruel. They hadn't only erased my cabin, they had replaced it with their seat of power. Block walls had been poured over foundation lines that once belonged to my home. Their polished floors rested where my unfinished dreams had been. Standing in front of that building, I felt the realization settle, sharp and cold. This wasn't carelessness. This wasn't a mistake. This was intentional. The HOA had known exactly what they were doing. They had gambled that I was gone. They had gambled that no one would look too deeply. They had gambled that profit outweighed risk. They had gambled that the rightful landowner would never return. And for a year they were right. But they weren't right anymore, because I was standing on my land again. And they were standing on a ticking bomb disguised as luxury real estate. I stepped back onto the road, absorbing everything I had uncovered in the first hour of my return. The paved streets, the manicured lawns, the structures worth millions, the HOA headquarters on the grave of my cabin, the silent hum of a community built on lies. My land was gone, but legally it wasn't. Their mansions stood proud, but legally they trembled. The HOA believed they had expanded, but they had only multiplied the consequences they now owed. I turned away from the mansions, knowing what must come next. Before confrontation, before accusations, before exposing them, I needed documents, proof, records, and a trail they couldn't deny. They had spent a year building their empire. I would spend the next few weeks unraveling it. With every step away from the stolen development, the plan became clearer. I wasn't here just to reclaim property. I was here to collect what they owed me. And whether they realized it yet or not, they were about to start paying rent. The next morning, I woke with a single purpose: to uncover every record, every file, and every forgotten document that would reveal how the HOA had turned my land into their private gold mine. What had happened on that property was too organized, too polished, too large to be a spontaneous mistake. There had to be paperwork behind it, good or bad, legitimate or forged. Some trace of the path they had taken to justify building an entire luxury subdivision on land they did not own. And if there was a trail, I would follow it to the very end. My first stop was the county recorder's office, the place where every property deed, survey, transfer, sale, and boundary adjustment lived. The building itself was old, its walls carrying decades of quiet bureaucratic history, but the records inside were exact, undeniable, and timeless. They didn't care about HOA influence, community power, or neighborhood politics. They cared only about facts, stamps, signatures, and dates, which made this the one place the HOA couldn't manipulate with landscaping and charm. I requested the file for my land, parcel numbers, recorded boundaries, and ownership certificates. The clerk slid the folder across the counter, unaware of the storm brewing beneath its pages. When I opened it, the truth hit me with a strange mix of reassurance and cold satisfaction. Everything was exactly as I had left it. My name sat on the deed in bold print. The boundary lines remained untouched. The surveys matched the original layouts. The property taxes were up to date, stamped, logged, and filed. There were no transfers, no liens, no foreclosure filings, and no legal adjustments. Nothing had been modified, not even a single line. Legally, the land was as untouched as it had been the day I purchased it. The development standing on it had absolutely no legal foundation. But the next files I opened painted a very different picture. The HOA had submitted expansion requests, multiple ones, over the last year. Each request attempted to justify the same idea: that the unused land beside the established community could be integrated, repurposed, or absorbed into the neighborhood's jurisdiction. Their justification? That the land was abandoned. They had leaned heavily on that word. They used it in bold print. They carried it through paragraphs like a shield. They wielded it as if repetition could make it true. But the county wasn't convinced. In the margins, I saw handwritten notes from different officials, each one expressing the same concern. No legal proof of abandonment. Owner remains active in tax system. HOA has not demonstrated ownership claim. Construction not approved.
No duseresascen granted.
Their expansion request had been rejected. again, and again, and again. Yet the mansions still stood, which meant that the HOA hadn't waited for approval. They had built illegally, without permission, without oversight, and without even a pretense of following the rules. Not a mistake, a defiance. As I flipped through the pages, I found an aerial map printed only a few months earlier. My land was circled in red ink with the word future phase scribbled across it, like they had already claimed it as their own. Additional circles marked planned parks, community pools, and more mansions. My property wasn't just stolen. It had been woven into the HOA's future empire. They believed my absence was permanent, and their arrogance had grown to match that belief. But it wasn't until I moved to the financial reports that the reality of their operation became fully clear. The HOA wasn't just expanding. They were profiting massively. Property sale records, rental agreements, construction invoices, special assessment income, landscaping fees, community development surcharges, all tied to the new mansions, all tied to my land. They had made more money off my property in a single year than I had made in my best working years combined. The HOA members, the developers, even the contractors, they had all fed on the soil I owned, turning it into revenue streams that lined their pockets while they believed the original owner was gone forever. And now those profits formed a paper trail of their guilt. I copied every document, each page a weapon for the battle ahead. The clerk helped me notarize the duplicates, unaware that these quiet pages were about to shake a community built on lies. When I returned to the property, I walked the pavement slowly, absorbing everything with new eyes. What I saw now wasn't a beautiful neighborhood. It was a monument to arrogance, greed, and a gamble the HOA was about to lose. The residents strolled across manicured lawns, sipping morning coffee, unaware that the land beneath their feet was contested. Children played in yards built on illegal foundations. Construction crews finished new houses, hammering boards into walls that were never meant to stand. Every nail they drove into the wood was another nail in the HOA's coffin. At the far end of the development, I approached the HOA's new operations building. The structure was practically theatrical in its confidence. Large glass windows, modern finishes, expensive signage. It was a building created to project control. But all I saw was the arrogance of an organization that believed it could rewrite land ownership with enough money and boldness. Near the front entrance sat a small bench with papers scattered across it. Financial statements, meeting notes, architectural plans. I scanned them quickly, and one detail stood out. References to projected revenue from future expansions. They were already planning to build more. On my land. The HOA had not only stolen what was mine, they were planning to steal even more. As I stepped away from the structure, the truth settled over me like a cold, deliberate shadow. They didn't just build mansions on my land. They built a future on a lie. A future I now had the power to collapse. And as I walked back toward my truck, with every proof-filled document secure in my hands, one thing became absolutely certain. The HOA had no idea that I had returned. They had no idea that I had all the evidence. They had no idea that every mansion in their kingdom was now standing on borrowed time. This wasn't just a property dispute anymore. This was the beginning of their reckoning. By the time I returned to the outskirts of the stolen subdivision, the weight of what I carried felt heavier than any physical load. The stack of documents, maps, financial records, and rejected filings inside my folder was more than paperwork. It was a mirror reflecting the HOA's greed, arrogance, and carelessness. Their empire looked clean from the outside: sleek architecture, organized streets, luxurious designs, and families who believed they had bought into something prestigious. But beneath the polished surface lay rot. Not in the buildings themselves, but in the foundation of lies they were built upon. Because every beautiful mansion stood on land that legally belonged to someone else. Every driveway was poured illegally. Every property line was a fiction. Every sale was built on deception. Every resident lived on a ticking legal time bomb. And the HOA had no idea the clock had started counting down. As I walked the streets that should never have existed, I noticed something I hadn't paid much attention to the day before. Everything was new. Every house was less than a year old. Every lawn freshly planted. Every street lamp freshly installed. every sidewalk still bright from recent construction. The entire neighborhood had been built rapidly, aggressively, and with a level of confidence that bordered on delusion. They hadn't just expanded, they had sprinted into expansion, racing to complete as much as possible before anyone questioned them. Speed was their strategy. Silence was their shield. Profit was their motive. But speed leaves mistakes, and silence leaves evidence. I walked deeper into the subdivision, studying every detail with a more trained eye. After everything I'd learned at the county office, the signs of their shortcuts were suddenly everywhere. The grading around some houses was uneven, done hastily instead of meticulously. Drainage pipes were clumsily fitted, suggesting rushed installation. Several yards had settling soil, indicating poor foundation prep. Sidewalk sections already had hairline cracks, too early for normal wear. They built fast not because they were efficient, but because they were afraid of being stopped. They knew they were building without approval. They knew they were violating laws. They knew they were constructing on disputed land. And they gambled that no one would notice. I kept walking until the rows of mansions gave way to the center of the development, the heart of the HOA's new Phase 2, as they had labeled it in their stolen paperwork. This central area was a plaza of sorts, anchored by the HOA's operations building. The building sat precisely where my cabin once stood. Seeing it again, knowing they had wiped away everything I'd built and replaced it with their symbol of control, made my next steps even more certain. The building was empty at the moment, likely between board activities, but I didn't need to enter to understand what happened inside. The HOA had used it as a command center, planning expansions, approving illegal construction, mapping future phases, holding meetings where they congratulated themselves on their development success. They had built their pride on my land, and soon they would be forced to pay for every inch of it. I continued my walk, watching residents living their daily lives, blissfully unaware that everything around them was tangled in a legal disaster that the HOA had created. They had been soul dreams built on stolen soil, and as much as I felt wronged, I also felt a quiet sympathy for them. They were victims of the HOA too. But the ones who orchestrated this, the board members, the developers, the contractors who knowingly built on land not theirs, they would feel the consequences. And not lightly. At the far back section of the development, I found something even more troubling. Active construction. A massive mansion was only half complete, surrounded by lumber piles, concrete mixers, and scaffolding. Workers moved quickly, unaware of the legal storm forming around them. Beyond that mansion, survey markers dotted the ground, bright orange flags marking lot lines for future houses. They weren't just done building on my land. They were still going. They were expanding even deeper into the acreage, cutting into the final untouched corner of my property. The flags lined up neatly, their positions calculated and deliberate, marking future profits they assumed were guaranteed. If I hadn't returned when I did, another year would have passed, and they would have claimed even more. And after enough time had passed, they would have pressured the county for rezoning or retroactive approval. They would have cited resident interest, financial impact, community needs. They would have made it harder, maybe almost impossible, to reverse what they had done. My return didn't just reveal their crime. It stopped it. I stood at the far edge of the development, looking out at the line where construction ended and the rest of my land still lay untouched. A boundary not marked by law, but by the HOA's assumption of how long I'd stay gone. Their mistake was believing absence meant surrender. Didn't. Absence meant observation, and now observation meant action. I turned around and walked back toward the center, passing by the residents again. Their homes were beautiful but also fragile not in structure, but in legitimacy. They deserved to know the truth. They deserved honesty the HOA never gave them, and soon they would know. The HOA had taken everything from my land, from my cabin to my future plans, and transformed it into a profit machine. But in doing so, they created a trail of evidence so large, so obvious, and so reckless, that the moment I unleashed it, their entire empire would collapse. And collapse publicly. The arrogance that built these mansions would be the same arrogance that destroyed everything they had constructed. The next step was clear. I had to gather every shred of proof. I had to prepare every document. I had to confront them, not with anger or threats, but with the law they had violated at every turn. They built illegally. They profited illegally. They operated illegally. And soon they would pay legally. As the sun dipped behind the row of mansions, casting long shadows across land that was still, and always had been, mine, I knew the real battle was about to begin. The days following the confirmation of the forged documents unfolded like the tightening of a noose. Quiet at first, almost unnoticeable, but steadily constricting around the HOA board that had grown far too comfortable in their stolen kingdom. What had once been whispers of suspicion now hardened into undeniable facts. Every document, every transaction, every approval coded with fraudulent signatures began to paint a picture of an organization that believed itself untouchable. The county offices, now fully aware of the situation, moved with a seriousness they didn't show before. There was no more dismissal, no more brushing off, no more weary half-interest. The land dispute had transformed into a legal storm swirling larger each hour. Behind the scenes, the county attorney's office assembled a specialized task group. They sifted through years of HOA filings, construction permits, land reassessments, and council meeting minutes. The deeper they dug, the more rot they uncovered. Meanwhile, the HOA board members carried themselves with forced confidence. Their smiles were too tight, their greetings too formal, their actions too rehearsed. Even from afar, their behavior revealed cracks forming in their once smug facade. They postponed meetings. They ceased issuing fines. They suddenly softened their strict rules. All outward signs indicated they felt something shifting under their feet, but they didn't yet know the full extent of their impending downfall. The new mansion owners, once indifferent to the drama around them, began to feel anxious. Their multi-million-dollar properties, standing tall and ostentatious on someone else's land, had quickly shifted from symbols of prestige to anchors of dread. Every morning, as they stepped outside to admire their lawns, the possibility crept deeper into their minds. All of this beauty was built on stolen ground. The sense of unease spread like a quiet infection. As for me, each day became a carefully orchestrated process. Gathering evidence, forwarding documents, recording calls, and assembling timelines in neatly labeled files. The more detailed the records, the stronger the case became. The paper trail was damning. The HOA had not made a single oversight. They had woven an entire tapestry of illegal actions. A forged transfer here, a manipulated permit there, a falsified board vote slipped between them. It all created a pattern that no one could ignore. Finally, movement came from the county investigators. They reached out with a calm tone that betrayed the gravity of their findings. There was no need for dramatic announcements. The evidence spoke for itself. My land had been illegally claimed, illegally sold, and illegally built on. The HOA, once confident in their fraud, now stood exposed. The first official action was a cease and desist order placed on the HOA's entire development. The county sent it with urgency. Construction halted instantly. Every builder, contractor, and landscaper was pulled off-site. The last echo of hammering died abruptly, replaced by an unnerving silence. The HOA board convened an emergency meeting. Something rare, something desperate. Homeowners whispered as they watched board members shuffle into the clubhouse with thick folders, pale faces, and stiff shoulders. Even from a distance, the building felt heavy, like it was absorbing the fear trapped inside it. Inside that room, the board learned the truth. The county was preparing to press charges. Civil, criminal, contractual. The HOA's foundation, once built on control and intimidation, now crumbled under the weight of potential indictments. Some board members tried to argue the innocence of their decisions. Others attempted to shift blame. A few merely sat in silence, staring ahead, accepting the inevitable collapse. But their panic did not stop the county from taking the next step. A formal notice was delivered, short, blunt, and devastating. Not only would they face legal action, but they would also be held liable for all damages, costs, and losses. The land they stole would be reinstated to me, and every mansion built upon it would be placed into legal limbo. The once proud homeowners fell into chaos. Some demanded answers. Others confronted board members. Some secretly began contacting lawyers of their own. The most desperate started searching for loopholes or exit strategies, hoping to protect their newfound wealth from the oncoming legal tidal wave. Yet the most shocking twist hadn't been revealed, not to the board, not to the homeowners, not even fully to me. When the county ran the financial records of the HOA, they uncovered a much deeper scheme. Diverted funds, embezzled maintenance budgets, hidden accounts under shell companies, and kickback payments from contractors. What had begun as a simple land dispute exploded into a full-scale investigation of corruption. This revelation didn't stay buried. It leaked first to a small local forum, then to neighborhood chats, then to social media. Within hours, the news spread across the community like wildfire. HOA Nightmare Scandal. The headlines practically wrote themselves. Outrage boiled across the neighborhood. Trust evaporated. And the board, who once ruled through intimidation, now lived under fearful scrutiny. As the sun set that day, casting long shadows over the mansions built on my land, I walked along the boundary line, taking in everything. The houses, the tension, the unraveling power structure collapsing from within. This was no longer a simple fight for ownership. It had become a reckoning. And the next stage, the stage where everything turned in my favor, that was just about to begin. The days that followed felt like watching a kingdom crumble from the outside, slow enough to absorb every detail, yet fast enough that no one inside could stop it. What began as quiet legal motions escalated into full-blown structural collapse for the HOA. The board members who once walked through the neighborhood with puffed chests and raised chins now moved cautiously, their confidence replaced by paranoia. Official notices continued arriving in thick envelopes stamped with county seals. The HOA clubhouse, once the heart of their authority, transformed into a war room filled with flustered administrators, panicked volunteers, and lawyers who looked more drained with each passing hour. Every time they opened another letter, the news only worsened. Frozen accounts, asset audits, mandatory hearings, immediate compliance orders, and warnings of criminal charges if they interfered. The homeowners, the ones who unknowingly purchased mansions built illegally, could no longer pretend to be uninvolved. They had invested millions into their homes, believing the HOA had done everything legally. Now their futures hung in limbo. Some tried to rally together, forming unofficial groups determined to challenge the HOA. Others retreated into silence, overwhelmed by the realization that their extravagant living spaces were sitting on a legal fault line that could split at any moment. Amid this unraveling chaos, the county appointed a temporary investigator to oversee the community. His presence signaled that the situation had spiraled well beyond a simple dispute. He walked the neighborhood daily, clipboard in hand, documenting violations, inspecting property lines, reviewing construction sites, and interviewing worried residents. His calm demeanor only amplified the gravity of the HOA's predicament. No one could ignore the investigation's seriousness anymore. Meanwhile, the financial audit unearthed details that shocked even the county officials. The HOA's leadership had engaged in a web of deliberate deception, overbilling homeowners, fabricating maintenance expenses, channeling funds into personal accounts, and forming behind-the-scenes partnerships with construction companies to secure mutual financial gain. The scale of their corruption stretched back years. Every revelation pushed the community closer to collapse. But for me, everything was slowly aligning. The land records had been corrected. My legitimate ownership reinstated. The fraud exposed. The mansions, every single one, were now built on what legally belonged to me. But far from celebrating, I approached everything with careful patience. The goal wasn't revenge. The goal was justice, restitution, and proper compensation for the violation of my property. Lawyers began contacting me, not with pressure or threats, but with a new tone, respect. They spoke of settlement strategies, long-term leasing agreements, potential rental contracts, and compensation packages that stretched into the millions. The homeowners, once tied to the HOA's arrogance, now saw me as the only path to stability. Their futures depended on me agreeing to negotiations. But negotiations had to wait. The legal foundation had to be finalized first. The county prepared for a formal hearing, a multi-session review where every detail of the HOA's actions would be examined publicly. Word spread quickly, and residents whispered about the upcoming proceedings with equal parts dread and anticipation. Board members scrambled desperately, hiring additional lawyers and attempting to spin narratives that painted them as misguided leaders rather than criminals. The morning of the hearing had a surreal stillness. The air felt heavier, as though the neighborhood itself was bracing. The community center filled with county officials, investigators, legal representatives, and dozens of homeowners who eagerly took seats, hoping for clarity or justice. The HOA board sat near the front, their shoulders rigid, their expressions measured. Gone were their authoritative postures. Gone was the unshakable confidence. In its place was the resigned tension of people who understood the magnitude of what was coming. One by one, the county officials read their findings into the record. The forged land transfer, the illegal construction permits, the manipulated board votes, the diverted funds, the embezzlement, the fraudulent property tax filings, the collusion with contractors, the deliberate efforts to erase my land records. The room fell silent as the complete truth unfolded, piece by devastating piece. The final announcement hit harder than anything else. Every mansion built on my land had been constructed illegally, and the HOA bore full responsibility, financially and criminally. The homeowners themselves were declared victims of fraud, freeing them from the worst consequences but leaving them in a delicate position. As the hearing concluded, what remained was the aftermath. A shattered HOA leadership with impending charges, a community scrambling for answers, and my land restored, albeit now covered with luxury mansions created without my consent. Walking outside afterward, I saw the neighborhood in a new light, not as a battleground, not as stolen ground, but as a place where the balance of power had finally shifted back to where it belonged. The board members left in small, defeated groups. Homeowners watched them go with a mixture of anger and betrayal. Some turned toward me cautiously, as if unsure how to approach the person whose land they now lived upon. Everything felt fragile, uncertain, but full of possibility. The next stage was approaching, a stage where decisions would determine the future of every mansion built on my land. The stage where compensation would be decided. The stage where they would begin paying me rent. In the weeks that followed the hearing, the neighborhood transformed into something unrecognizable. What was once the domain of an all-powerful HOA had become a community balanced on uncertainty. The mansions glistened under the morning sun as they always had, but beneath their polished surfaces lay the heavy truth that they no longer belonged to the families living inside them. Not fully, not legally, not anymore. Each homeowner now faced a reality tied directly to me. Their futures depended not on the ruined HOA board, not on the contractors who built their homes, and not on the corrupted system that enabled the fraud. Their futures depended on the person who still legally owned every square foot of dirt under their multimillion-dollar foundations. My land. What they built, what they landscaped, what they furnished, and what they proudly showcased to visitors, all stood on ground that was never rightfully transferred. The county's final ruling arrived quietly one morning, printed on crisp paper with an official seal. It declared in precise, unambiguous terms that I retained full ownership of the land and held legal authority to determine its use. The structures on top of it, while paid for by the homeowners, existed only through agreements that I would set. The weight of that decision rippled through the community. Homeowners read the ruling with trembling hands and conflicted expressions. Some were relieved to finally have answers. Others sank into deep frustration, realizing that despite their wealth, their dreams, and their immaculate homes, they were bound to someone else's land. The HOA, stripped of power, could do nothing to intervene. Its board members, now under active investigation, slowly disappeared from the neighborhood, leaving behind a trail of resentment and unanswered questions. The next step fell to me. Lawyers arranged meetings with each mansion owner, outlining the path forward. There were no threats, no ultimatums, no revenge-driven conditions, only clear, legally supported options. They could negotiate long-term land leases, stable, fair, fully regulated contracts that would protect their investments and allow them to remain in their homes. Or, if they wished, they could sell their houses to me directly at a significantly reduced value and walk away from the mess the HOA had created. Most chose the leases. And with that decision came the moment no one had anticipated. The day the rent agreements were signed. Residents filed into the county office in a quiet procession. Many of them avoided eye contact. Many carried a subdued shame, not directed at me, but at the HOA that had tricked them into believing they owned land they never rightfully purchased. One by one, pens scratched across paper, formalizing contracts that would change the neighborhood forever. For the first time, power returned to its rightful place. Not through force, not through confrontation, but through law, resilience, and truth. It was a strange sight. Towering mansions lined across a once empty field, their owners now entering financial agreements with the very person the HOA had tried to erase from the community. When the leases became active, the shift in atmosphere was undeniable. The once prideful homeowners adopted more measured tones. They treated the land with a respect that hadn't existed before. They maintained their lawns more diligently. They reported issues politely. They no longer acted entitled or dismissive. It was as though the realization of being tenants on someone else's land humbled them naturally. And ironically, what the HOA spent years trying to control through fines, threats, and rigid rules, I achieved simply through fairness. The community stabilized. Time softened the shock, smoothing the rough edges of resentment. A new neighborhood culture formed. One more cooperative, more grounded, more honest. The scars left by the HOA's greed lingered, but they served as reminders of what unchecked power could do. As for the former board members, their downfall continued. Lawsuits piled higher each month. Investigators tracked missing funds. Prosecutors assembled cases. Their carefully crafted facades, once shining with authority, crumbled under the weight of their crimes. And through it all, my land remained intact. Sometimes at dusk, I stood at the edge of the neighborhood. The same boundary I once returned to after a year away. The same line where I first discovered the mansions rising from soil that was supposed to be untouched. The golden light cast long shadows, illuminating every structure, every roofline, every window reflecting the evening sky. It was strange, almost poetic. They tried to steal my land. They tried to erase my ownership. They built mansions without permission, believing that I would never return. But I came back, and in the end, they didn't just lose their power, they now paid me to live on what was always mine. What began as a violation ended as victory. A quiet one, a lawful one, complete one. The neighborhood breathed differently now, not under the weight of fear, but under the balance of truth. And as I turned away from the land at sunset, the final chapter of the fight closed behind me. Not with destruction, not with revenge, but with justice fully served.